Thank you, everybody, for joining us for what we hope is the first TRM book club. And we want to start by thanking the Farhis for this idea and for sponsoring this morning's book club. And I'm embarrassed to say I actually had not read this book yet until this happened, and it was excellent. And I'm really excited to participate in this discussion today. So we want to welcome Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs, who's the founding director of Atid, the Academy for Torah Initiatives and Directions in Jewish Education in Jerusalem, and is also a web yeshiva.org program. He also very excitedly became the editor of the journal Tradition and is the series editor of the Agnon Library at the Toby Press and director of research at the Agnon House in Jerusalem. He's a three-time graduate of Yeshiva University, and has published widely on Jewish thought, education, and literature. And with that, I will hand it over to him. I just ask everybody to mute themselves, and looking forward to a great discussion this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Osband, and thanks for inviting me. Unfortunately, I was supposed to be with you in person a few weeks ago, but the world got in the way. I think about a year ago, I was at the Riverdale Minyan for a different talk on Agnon, and I hope that maybe next spring I'll get back in person. And thanks, of course, to the Farhis. I had a chance encounter in the bookstore in Riverdale with Jacques, has led to this nice relationship of things related to Agnon and Jewish life and literature and learning. So we appreciate that very much. We value that relationship very much. I was assured by Yardena that in your book club, everyone will have read the book carefully. But I don't take anything for granted. Could be maybe somebody snuck in past Yardena's careful guardianship who didn't do all of their homework, and you'll have to work out your final grade with her. So I'll assume that many of us have read the book, but I don't take for granted that everyone has. And those of you that haven't are here on your good word that you will finish reading, and the crooked shall be made straight. Agnon's great novel, his novella, rather, I should say, that really put him on the map of the world as the rising literary star in the new Hebrew literature at the beginning of the previous century. Of course, those of you who are able to read Agnon in Hebrew really ought to. In Hebrew, the story is called V'haya He'ekov Lamishor, and it appears in Agnon's Hebrew volume Elu Ve'elu. In English, it appears as a standalone volume as part of the Toby Press Agnon series, which I edited. It was translated by my friend Michael Kramer, Professor Michael Kramer of Bar-Ilan University, and it contains copious annotations and footnotes that try to unpack some of what Agnon is doing. Those of you who have read a bit of Agnon know that almost the central theme of his writing is the kind of intertextual matrix that he builds, drawing on the wealth of you see all these books behind me. I'm sitting in Agnon's library in Yerushalayim. I'm actually in my home, but this is one of those virtual Zoom backgrounds, and you can see only one fraction of the books in his library. And part of his achievement was to take the entirety of the corpus of Jewish literature, from the Bible through Midrash, all of Chazal, Mishnah, Talmud, medieval Hebrew literature, medieval Hebrew poetry, Hasidic literature, the literature of the Haskalah. I'm sure I'm missing a few stations along the way, and to distill it all into the mold of modern literature. And that's what he does in this Vaya Kov Lemishor, and the crooked shall be made straight. Of course, the title is a pasuk in Yeshayahu, from the famous parak, which we'll read not too far off. Sooner, before we know it, it'll be Tisha B'Av already.
Jake, this is from your bar mitzvah haftorah.
I'm sorry? I'm sorry, someone made a comment, but I couldn't. Okay. the famous haftarah of Shabbat Nachemu Ami Yomar Elokechem, console, comfort ye my people. Kol gei yinosei v'chol har v'givai yishpalu v'aya ha'kov lemishor. Right, every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill shall be made low. Those of you that know Handel's Messiah, those of you that don't know the haftarah for Parshat Nachamu, that's bad enough, but you might not know Handel's Messiah, right? Every mountain shall be exalted, and the crooked shall be made straight. Agnon takes the title of the book from this verse in Yeshayahu, but it's not at all clear what is that which is crooked in the story and how is it straightened. Some have observed that maybe he chose the title ironically, because at the end, the crookedness, that which is broken, is not entirely straightened. Some have observed that perhaps a better title would have been a pasuk from Kohelet, Hamu'uvat lo yachol litkon. That which is broken or distorted cannot be repaired. There are certain things, we don't always get it right. But there's tshuva, there's repentance. You can fix things. But there's certain things, sometimes if it's certain things that are broken cannot be repaired. The Talmud says, what is the case of hamuvat lo yachol litkon? That which is crooked cannot be repaired. The Gemara says that's somebody who has relations with a married woman. And that leads to, unfortunately, to the resulting birth of a mamzer, someone who is halachically banned from entering into marriage in the conventional sense. Well, we know what a mamzer is. That's a case of hamu'uvat lo yochel litkon. There are certain things for which there is no remedy. And if you have read through the story, you understand the resonance of that, why some might have thought that pasuk, with its rabbinic interpretation about the birth of mamzerim, might have been a more appropriate title for this story. But Agnon chose V'haya Kov L'Mishor. In the end, there is a correcting, there is a repair of the story. But in order to understand what that is, you have to first understand what exactly has gone wrong in the story. The story was written in 1912. Agnon, of course, was born in Galicia, what today is Western Ukraine, in 1888. In fact, he was born in 1887. He always said he was born on Tisha B'Av, 1888, but we won't go into all of that biography now. At around the age of 20, in 1908, he made Aliyah to Yafo. Here's what Yafo looked like at the beginning of the previous century. In Yafo, like almost every other member of the second Aliyah, the wave of immigration of European Jewry to Eretz Yisrael in the decade before the First World War, like almost every other young man of the second Aliyah, he removed his yarmulke and adopted a secular lifestyle. Later in life, he would return to traditional observance and rather punctilious observance. But for a period of time in his youth, in his early adulthood, he, what the colloquial expression today is, went off the derech. But during that time, he sets himself up as a young author of the newly revived Hebrew language, and part of his achievement, of course, was helping to craft the new Hebrew language as it was simultaneously flowing out of his pen. He begins to write and publish stories, and he comes to the attention of a whole variety of people, including Yosef Chaim Brenner, who was at that time the most significant figure in Hebrew literature in the land of Israel. Brenner unfortunately met a tragic death a number of years later. But when Agnon publishes Vayakov Lemishor in 1912, it's first serialized in the Poel HaTzair newspaper, and then Brenner himself pays to publish the story in book format. And here's a copy of you see here the 1912 first edition of the story. It was Agnon's. For Agnon at that point was a short story author. He would write stories that would be published in literary journals, in newspapers, in Hebrew newspapers that were still being published in in Europe, or the few that were being published in the land of Israel. And after the 6 installments of the story appeared in the newspaper, Brenner pays to have the story published in book form, making it Agnon's first book. Gershom Shalom, the granddaddy of the study, the academic study of Kabbalah, who was a close friend of Agnon's. They met during a period in which Agnon spent a number of years in Germany, and then, of course, both of them returned to the land of Israel. Shalom was about 10 years younger than Agnon, but they shared a very close relationship. He has an essay called S.Y. Agnon, the Last Hebrew Classic. If you want to read one essay on Agnon, I would recommend that one. If you Google it, you might find it, and if not, you can email me, and I'm happy to send you a PDF of the article. But in that article, Agnon, the Last Hebrew Classic, I maintain that's a mistake. The question mark in the title was probably placed there by the editor. If you read Shalom's essay, there's no question. He's declaring that Agnon was indeed the last Hebrew classic. But he says, what greater paradox could there be than the fact that the weekly of a socialist group, Hapoel Hatzair, the newspaper of the young workers organization in the land of Israel, a group strongly influenced by Tolstoyan and Narodniki ideas, published in a long series of installments Agnon's first book, Ve'ya'akov L'mishor, The Crooked Shall Be Made Straight. The story develops an Enoch Arden theme, I'll come back to that, in a strictly traditional Hasidic framework. It is written not so much in the style of the old devotional books as in the style their authors would have used had they been great artists. The idea that the work is, new wine in old flasks. What Agnon has done is he's taken the form of the Hasidic tale, the Hasidic folk tale, and written it as modern literary art. Right? In other words, it's a Hasidic tale. If Hasidic tales would have been written by Nobel Prize winning authors, and written in this new form of Hebrew. Now, Agnon's Hebrew, those of you that have read Agnon's Hebrew know that it is not contemporary Hebrew. People read Agnon, they think it's antiquated, they make mistakes like saying reading Agnon to the modern Hebrew reader is like reading Shakespeare to the modern English reader. That's certainly not true. There's a kind of anxiety that students feel when they approach Agnon for the matriculation exams. It's hard, it's not possible to read. It's not true. There's no intelligent Israeli high school student who can't read Agnon and understand what he said, what Agnon is saying. But here and there, there'll be words that are unfamiliar to him, just like there'll be words unfamiliar to an English reader reading something, that was authored 100 years ago. Here and there will be concepts, particularly concepts from the Beit Midrash, particularly concepts from the halachic literature that unfortunately not every Israeli is going to understand. But you know what? Everybody walks around with the collected wisdom of Western civilization in their pocket. You can look things up if there's something that you don't readily understand. Shalom goes on to say, Brenner, Yosef Chaim Brenner, a convinced atheist who was the first to recognize Agnon's literary genius, scraped together his last shillings to publish the story in book form in 1912. Incidentally, the man who set it in print was a convinced follower of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, one of the great saints of Hasidism. It is on record that both these men took the greatest delight in the book, thereby anticipating, so to speak, all the later contradictory attitudes of Agnon's admirers. For Brenner, it represented the first work of secular Hebrew literature in which tradition had become the medium of pure art, untouched by extraneous factors, such as criticism of or apologetics for Jewish society. For the typesetter, for the Breslover Chosid, whom I have known for many years, It was a true embodiment of Hasidic lore and spirit. And in fact, Agnon in that period had grown quite close with Rav Kook. Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the sainted later chief rabbi of Palestine, then the rabbi of Yafo, who took great interest in the young author's work and asked to read his stories while they were still in manuscript. Because you know that Rav Kook thought that part of the return to Eretz Yisrael was not just the physical revival of the Jewish people, not just the pioneering spirit of plowing the fields and paving the roads, but it would be a cultural revival of the Jewish people in their own land. And that's why, as opposed to the rabbis of the Yishuv HaYashan, the what today we call the Haredi set, who were very ambivalent, at best were ambivalent about using Hebrew as a modern everyday language. Rav Kook supported that. Rav Kook supported the establishment of the Hebrew University, of the Bezalel School of Arts. In time, he came to have criticisms of the way certain things were done, but he understood that part of the revival of a nation who had been banished from their land and their language and their literature for 2,000 years would be the revival of cultural creativity. In other words, every healthy nation has literature. If we were to take Crime and Punishment, War and Peace, Romeo and Juliet, and translate it into the new modern Hebrew, that does not ipso facto make it Hebrew literature. The new Hebrew literature, as Shalom says Brenner observed, would have to emanate from out of the sources of Jewish life, which for 2,000 years, the literary sources of Jewish life had been principally halachic and midrashic texts, the engagement and analysis with Torah Sheba'al Peh and Torah Shebichtav. What would it mean to write modern literature that comes out of that? So Rav Kook reads Vayakov Lemishor, and the crooked shall be made straight, when it was still in manuscript. And Agnon was a little hesitant about giving it to him, because after all, what is it? This is not the Mesilat Yesharim. This is not the Moreh Nevuchim. What is this a story about? It's a story about extramarital sexual relations that lead to the birth of a mamzer. And Rav Kook hands it back to him, and Agnon records Rabbeinu Hagadol, Rabbi Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, Zichron Levracha, how close he drew me in. In his humility, he was kind enough to read my story, Vayakov Lemishor, which was then still in manuscript. When he returned it to me, he said in these exact words, Zehu sipur ivri be'emet, novea minat sinarot blo shum mechitza. This is a true Ivri story. Now, Ivri can mean a Jewish story, it can mean a Hebrew story. An authentic Jewish Hebrew story flowing through the divine channels without any barrier. Whatever that Kabbalistic concept means, I don't know, and I can't explain for you here, but it's a great blurb for the jacket of your book, right? You know, Rav Kook gives it 5 stars, right? It flows through the divine channels with no barrier, with no mechitza, because Rav Kook understood that this book is exactly the type of modern Hebrew literature that we need, because it indeed is a distillation of the halacha. What would it look if the halacha was a source of modern literature? Here we have it. The story itself. Is there anybody that read the story that could venture to give us a 2-minute plot summary? Do we have a volunteer? You can unmute you. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
I'll try if you like. I mean,
Yep.
if there's no one else. I've read the book at least. And by the way, there are 3 copies in the store where we met on Riverdale Avenue, if anyone else
Excellent.
wants to go and read it. The story is of a couple who are prosperous but run into financial difficulties. They own a store, they have no children, but they've been prosperous, member of the community, I suppose in Agnon's hometown.
Exactly,
fall,
in Buchach. He says it right here. It's in the holy city of Buchach. Yibane Iro Amen. May God rebuild his city.
So they fall on hard times. The store gets into trouble and it has to close, and they're left with no financial means. Eventually, the husband decides to go out as a beggar. He gets a letter from the rabbi of the city, who is very esteemed, and he sets off, I suppose, around Galicia to raise money.
To what we call in the elegant Hebrew, the elegant Yiddish term, to schnorr.
Right. So he's wandering around. He leaves his wife with her permission. She actually takes this letter and sews it onto a pad, I guess, of some sort. And he goes off and he has all sorts of, shall we say, adventures. He doesn't seem to write back to his wife at all. And eventually he falls into, shall we say, evil company of another beggar who offers to buy the letter, which is obviously a great asset in that profession, is having a letter from the rabbi, from this very, very distinguished rabbi.
Right. And after all, who would know? I mean, it's a case of identity theft, right? Who would know that it's this person's letter or that person's letter? It's just a really good letter that an industrious schnorrer can put to good effect to raise his intake.
So so this other beggar who buys the letter pays him a very good sum of money, which our hero goes and spends on a kind of, I wouldn't say an orgy, but a very elaborate meal, and
a hearty meal and a lot of drink.
A lot of drink, right? So the beggar, who is very evil, dies. I forget the circumstances, and somehow the letter is with him, and it's assumed that our hero, what's his name again? I forget now.
Our hero's name is Menashe Chaim.
Menashe Chaim. Menashe. So people assume that this beggar who died was Menashe Chaim.
Right, because after all, he has, in other words, it's the equivalent of he's carrying the man's American Express card, Social Security card, and Tudat Zehut, right? They find a dead body, and in his wallet is this identifying letter. Who else would have Menashe Chaim's letter from the rabbi except Menashe Chaim himself?
Right.
So now Menashe Chaim is presumed dead.
So the word gets back to the hometown, and the rabbi does tremendous consultations and studies because we don't want to have an aguna, which is always very much, I think, on Agnon's mind.
It's important to note that when the pseudo Menashe Chaim, the Menashe Chaim who is the beggar who is presumed to be Menashe Chaim, dies in the other town, he's buried in the other town. Bodies were not sent from town to town for burial. You were buried where you died, right? So his burial was there in the other town, and he's cold in the grave long before news of his death gets back to the rabbi of Buchach, who then has to deliberate: is his wife an aguna, or is the fact that this man was found with Menashe Chaim's letter enough to free his wife from the binds of being an aguna, which he decides, of course, after, as you say, much deliberation, he decides, of course, that she can remarry.
So Menashe Chaim then wanders around, has all sorts of more adventures, and apparently this whole thing is 5 years that he's traveling. Yes. He heads home, with great expectation of seeing his
Well, no,
wife.
it's because again, when he gets drunk that night that he sells the letter, and he wakes up in the garbage dump the next morning, he's been robbed of his wallet. All of the money he had raised, including the big sum that he got from this swindler who ended up dead, has been stolen. That's he had almost enough money to get back home and to start his life again. But now, having sold his letter, he has to start from scratch, and he has to start from scratch without the benefit of this very useful hamlatza, this useful letter of recommendation from the famous rabbi of Buchach. So that's why it takes so long, because when he's almost done, he has to start again from scratch, and now at a disadvantage.
So he heads home, and he's almost there. And then I guess at that point, the wife has given birth to a child with her new husband.
The wife is remarried and now has a child.
And is going to be the bris the next day. And he turns up at just that point. He doesn't know about it, but he's almost there, and then he gets the news. So he turns around, and he doesn't want to. This is why I think he's something of a hero. He turns around. He doesn't want to get involved in this terrible situation, and he goes to the cemetery where the other beggar is buried in the other town, and he seems to work there for a while, and eventually he dies. And the man in charge of the cemetery buries. Meanwhile, the wife has sent to have a stone put where she presumes her first husband was, and to have a very nice monument made for the deceased. And he somehow ends up in that grave instead of the beggar who had died. And he dies, and he's put into that grave. And that's how the story ends, more or less.
So that the gravedigger, who's the only one who knows the truth of the story, for Menashe Chaim has revealed the truth to him. When Menashe Chaim dies, the gravedigger puts the monument, the stone, that the wife, who now, of course, is in a much better position, because now she's remarried, she's married to a comfortable man, she has a comfortable lifestyle, and she has a child, the child that she never had children, of course, with Menashe Chaim. That of course, that fact helps the reader understand the childlessness that the couple suffered was not on account of her, but on account of him. That they were infertile all those years. Presumably, it was on account of him and not account of her, because as soon as she remarries, she immediately becomes pregnant, and 10 months later, has a child. But the gravedigger, or the Chevra Kadisha man in the cemetery, the cemetery watchman, he places the proper grave not over the grave of pseudo Menashe Chaim, the faker, but over the correct one. And this is the very excellent summary. Excellent summary. Yardena, you can give him all 10 points. But the book, this is what you
get it.
Right. What you see now is the 1919 edition, which was beautifully produced with woodcut, and it's laid out. You would pick up the book, and you would have thought that it was a traditional pious text, the way that it was produced. And in fact, there's apparently a story of a Hungarian Rav who read the book, and being completely unfamiliar with what literature is or what fiction is, mistook it for an actual kind of case. He didn't realize that what he was reading was what we know and recognize as a work of fiction. So the book begins with this kind of title page, this grandiose introduction. If you have the book in front of you, you can open up to the English. It's on page 1 of the book. And the crooked shall be made straight. Vayakov lemishor maaseh ba'adam echad ushmo Menashe Chaim. Right? It sounds like a like the opening of a Hasidic tale. Ma'aseh ba'adam echad u'shmo Menashe Chaim. Later, we'll learn he's a Kohen. He's a Kohen. That's relevant, of course, because had he revealed himself had he come back to town on the morning of his wife's son's brit, so she would have had to have divorced her husband. I mean, she would have had to divorce him. The retroactively, their marriage, in quotes, is invalid because she's already a married woman. The child becomes a mamzer, but she would have been unable to reunite with Menashe Chaim because he is a Kohen. So Maseh Badam Echad Ushmo Menashe Chaim Yoshvei Kahal Kadosh Buchach. Buchach is the town Agnon grew up in. It's, like I said, it's in what today is Western Ukraine. At the time, it was the eastern outreaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's important to remember this is not, I think we discussed this last year in Riverdale. Agnon stories in Europe do not, this is not Russia, this is not the Pale of Settlement, this is not Shalom Aleichem or Tevye the Milkman, this is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's a completely different reality. And on some other occasion, we can talk about those differences. Sheyarad minichasav ve'aniut rachman alatzan he'evarto al da'at kono. He fell upon hard times, losing everything he owned. Poverty made him lose sight of his creator. May the merciful one spare us. Right? So the source of his sin is poverty. Poverty and the difficulties of the impoverished life are central to much of Agnon's depiction of Eastern Europe, and the degree to which it conflicts, makes difficult the life of the religious Jew. Well, that's something that we know about today also, right? And maybe it was different then, but we can still recognize it. He left a stain upon Israel. Though he drifted from place to place, scorned and hounded, he refrained from ruining the lives of others by not revealing himself, and so preserved his name and left behind a lasting legacy. Shem v'she'erit b'Yisrael, v'zachal l'shem l'she'erit. Shem l'she'erit is a pasuk in Shmuel Bet, in the second chapter of Shmuel Bet. Generally, it's understood to mean your kind of lasting legacy, which is your children, right? He has no children. And what's his shem v'she'erit? What's his legacy? His legacy is a secret. Only we, the readers, know. And the gravedigger who knows the true story of his act of whether or not, and here we're not evaluating it, Rav Kook wasn't passing halachic judgment. He was passing aesthetic judgment on the story. That this man allowed himself to be destroyed in order to save the lives of others. All this will be explained and elaborated in the book. Of him and those like him, Scripture says, Va'az yiratzu et avonam, Perush Rashi Zal, right? The pasuk says, and then they will make amends for their sins. But Rashi explains, how does one amend for their sin? Their sufferings will atone for their sins. Ba'avonam kapru alavonam biyisurehem, right? That their suffering is atonement for their sin. And here is a man who suffers, and he comes out without a blemish. Although there is a blemish in the world, but the blemish has been suppressed or made invisible. So this kind of introduction sets out for us the themes in the book, the Yerida, the being brought down low from his kind of middle class existence to poverty, his sin, right? His sin, which is maybe generated through his poverty, but later we'll understand what that is, as Jacques explained. This act of selling this, I mean, the lack of integrity in selling that letter of recommendation, which then leads to his downfall and then leads to his his not getting back on time and his being presumed dead and the wife remarrying and having a child, and what happens to him. That's his punishment, right? The idea of amidah benisayon, of having to withstand the test, and that the test itself being cathartic, right? That he is rewarded in that he has shem v'she'erit in the end. Now, it's a bit ironic because in the end there's a monument with his name on it. He was going to be buried. The fellow that they think is Menashe Chaim, what I call the pseudo Menashe Chaim, the fake Menashe Chaim, is buried in Potter's grave, right? There was a corner of the cemetery where the indigent would be buried with no marker, with no stone. His Menashe Chaim's wife, when she kind of becomes stable, she remembers the love of her youth, and she knows that he's buried in that distant town, and she pays to have a monument erected over his grave. But what's the irony? The irony is that it's not even over him. It's over this person who stole his identity. And only because the gravedigger knew the truth and was able to fix things, v'haya akov lemishur, the crooked thing that Menashe Chaim isn't even lying underneath his own tombstone, is made straight, is made correct through the actions of that gravedigger. The story is, of course, a tragedy. It's a tragedy which is softened by the Agnonian humor from here to there, but that doesn't make it any less of a tragedy. It's a story, of course, about an Aguna. Agnon's own name, which was a pen name, Agnon's birth name was Chachkis. He was born Shmuel Yosef Chachkis, but he takes the Hebrew name Agnon when he publishes his first Hebrew story in 1908 upon reaching Yafo, a story called Agunot. We don't have time to go into it in depth, but the Agnon's story, Agunot, is not technically about Agunot the way that we use it. The way that we use Agunot is, of course, incorrect, or I should say it's imprecise. Colloquially, when we talk about Agunot today, we're really talking about what are in a halachic language are called Misuravot Get, women who are refused their writ of divorce, and therefore, because of the dynamics of halacha, cannot remarry. But they're not agunot in the classical sense. Of course, agunot are women whose husbands have gone off to, well, like Menashe Chaim. He's gone off on a journey and he never shows up. And we don't know where. Is he alive? Is he dead? Did the ship go down at sea? Well, there was no GPS and there was no cell phone and there was no way to tell. So in the absence of evidence about the death of a husband, a woman is an aguna. She's chained to her husband. But you realize that the classical, it really is an ironic use of the way language develops. The classical technical case of aguna is the mirror image of the way we colloquially use it today. I mean, today, here and there, you do have classical cases of aguna, but thankfully they are few and far between because of modern technologies and communications and things like that. It's very rare that either in America or in Israel that you have, like you have in Arlington, the tomb of the unknown soldier. There are no more unknown soldiers because of DNA and because of when I went to the army years ago. So the first day in the army, it's lo naim. It's not nice to think about it, but the whole first day of the army was trying to document me in case I ended up dead. DNA samples and blood samples and fingerprints and footprints and dental x-rays and head x-rays, and they got every part of your body in case, God forbid, they have to identify you. They can always do it. And part of that, besides, obviously the responsibility that a country feels towards its soldiers, part of that has to do with the terrible situation that would occur about agunot. So there are a few cases still, but it's exceedingly rare compared to the pre-modern era. But you understand that the way that we colloquially use aguna is the mirror image. The classical case of the aguna, she still loves him. She's waiting for him to return. It doesn't matter how long he's been gone. Every time there's a knock at the door, she thinks maybe it's him. The igun that she feels is not the way that we think of it today, like a woman chained like in prison. It's the mystical bond of emotion with which she is still connected to her missing husband. In the contemporary sense of the Misurevet get, we know where the husband is, and if we could only, whack him around enough and convince him to do the right thing, he would release her. But she hates the guy. She's sick of him. She doesn't want to see him. These are mirror images, and the way that we use aguna today is the opposite of what it was. So Agnon writes about agunot. So he's really talking about, it's a metaphor, it's a mashal for the condition of the Jewish people. The Jewish people are also agunot, because if in the rabbinic in the midrash, the Jewish people and God are like husband and wife, or wife and husband, right? We just had Shavuot, right? Kofen aleim har kegigid. He holds the mountain above us. The mountain is like the chuppah, and the Torah is like the ketubah, and the marital home is meant to be either Eretz Yisrael or the Mishkan or the Beit HaMikdash. So if we are married metaphorically, midrashically to God, so we're not divorced, but we could use a little marital therapy, because for 2,000 years, we have not lived together as man and wife in our marital home in Eretz Yisrael. And the story of Agunot is a story that's playing off of that theme of what it means for God and the Jewish people, for the Jewish people to be the Aguna of God, and what it means for us to start to return. It's a very Zionistic work, what it means for us to start to return to Eretz Yisrael. So these themes of Aguna, which you see repeated here and throughout Agnon's long career, are of course present here as well. Another central theme that Agnon displays here, which he has elsewhere, is the idea of Shiva Habaita, of homecoming, right? Of being distant from home and returning home, but getting home and you can't go home again. It's not the same home. Too much water under the bridge. Too much has changed. And of course, that can easily be understood as some kind of metaphor for the national return to the national homeland and what it means for us to come back and to try to create a new society. Finally, I should just mention this idea of his name, Menashe. What does the name Menashe Chaim mean? What does the name Menashe mean? Yosef calls his son Menashe. Ki nashani Elokim et kol amali ve'et kol beit avi. With the birth of his son, he says, that has caused me to forget all of my troubles, and it's caused me to forget my father's home from which I have been sold away. So Menashe, the name Menashe means forgotten, to cause to forget. So this character's name is what? Menashe Chaim. It's built into his name. He is forgotten in life. He is dead man walking. Right? It's as if he's a ghost. He's alive. We, the reader, know that he's alive. But for all of the people in his life for whom it's important, he is forgotten. He is as good as dead. Now, this theme, right? This theme of poverty, that he goes out, and even with this letter here in chapter 2, it's on page 32 in the book. It's the morning that he's about to set out on his journey. The cock crows at dawn. The shamus calls the service of the Creator. Menashe Chaim rose, went to the house of study, prayed with heartfelt emotion, and went forth to his labor. Perhaps God will turn his attention toward him and fill hearts with his mercies, so he could collect a bit of money to send his wife Krendel Charney. So mused Menashe Chaim. But of what worth are the musings of man? Many of the fallen have felt as Menashe Chaim felt, but what did it avail them? There are countless poor in town. He isn't the only beggar in Israel. Wherever he went, others preceded him. To be sure, when he unfurled the letter of recommendation, letting it serve as his mouthpiece and advocate, they wouldn't drive him away with both hands. Still, their curled lips made it clear that they valued even the smallest business dealing with a Gentile more than an act of charity or kindness to a Jew. And when he approached them, they would quip, "Are you bringing more frogs to Egypt?" Like a kind of Yiddish or rabbinic version of coals to Newcastle. Right? But we need another beggar? Now, it highlights the gap between the ideals and the reality, between the expressed values of the Jewish community and how those values played out in practice, not always in the proper manner. Charity and taking care of the poor, well, these are the bedrocks of Jewish life and Jewish custom. But they're not always implemented in reality. And Agnon is playing up on that. It's, like I said, Agnon is writing modern literature. He's not writing the Mesilat Yesharim. But there is nevertheless a musar. There is nevertheless a moral message to what he's saying. The indictment of the religious community then still bears some force for us today. The story of the man who goes from home to return is, well, the truth is, it says all in the Talmud already. The Gemara in Bava Kama, Daf Ayin Dalid, talks about the sugya of Ba Harug Biraglav. It's a case of Edim Zomimim, two conniving witnesses. The witnesses go and testify that they saw that Ruvain died. And the rabbis, of course, based upon the testimony of these witnesses, allow his wife to remarry. And then the next day, in walks Ruvain. Ba Harug Beraglav. The dead man walks in on his own two legs. The consequences of such a thing were well known even in antiquity. And they were known, of course, in world literature. Oedipus, in his long journey, what's the one thing that's driving him? Will Penelope remain faithful? Right? He returns. He returns home, and it's been so many years no one recognizes him. Who's the only? Does anyone know who recognizes Oedipus when he returns? His dog. The dog that he had was a pup when he left is now an old hound. The dog recognizes it. And Agnon, clearly, if you look on page 68, if you have the book, on page 68 in chapter 4, on page 68, he walks in. I'm sorry I don't have it for you on the screen. He returns, the bottom page 68, this is when he returns at the end on the day of the bris. On the strength that he rushed through the Gentile neighborhood till the dogs were wakened by the sound of his footstep. One big dog pounced on him and nearly frightened him to death. But the dog did him no harm. He merely lay in the dust of his feet and licked his clothes as if he had recognized him from long ago and wanted to show him how much he'd been missed. Agnon is lifting this from, he's not plagiarizing, it's an homage to the Odyssey. Of course, our story is a reverse. It's a subversion of the Oedipus theme. Of course, Penelope, all those years, had kept the suitors at bay, keeping herself chaste for her beloved husband's return. In the paragraph from Gershom Shalom, he mentions Enoch Arden. Enoch Arden is a long narrative poem by Tennyson, by Alfred Lord Tennyson, about a man a fisherman who loses his money, loses his business, and has to go off at sea, kind of like a merchant marine, in order to raise money to support his family. But he's shipwrecked, a kind of Robinson Crusoe situation. He's shipwrecked with a couple of other sailors. They all die. He's the only one to survive. And many years later, he gets home only to discover that the Rabbonim, or whoever Mrs. Arden had gone to, allowed her to remarry, because after all, her husband was presumed dead. And here's a woodcut that was published with the poem long ago, and him looking into the warm household of his children, now grown, being raised by another man. The idea, of course, gave this plot idea, lent itself to all types of films. There's a 1940 Cary Grant slapstick movie called My Favorite Wife, which is the same kind of thing. Cary Grant has one wife. He's presumed dead. She's presumed dead. It's the opposite. The genders are reversed. She's presumed dead. He remarries, and then she comes back. But there, it's used for slapstick. There's the Tom Hanks movie from 2000, which is also a kind of Robinson Crusoe type thing, Castaway, where he's lost on a desert island, and when he's rescued years later, his wife now has a new family. Now, of course, in these stories, you don't have the halachic consequence of mamzerut. Without going into the details, of course, this is perhaps the most intractable, difficult situation that we can encounter. The world would be turned upside down, and if possible, to find a way to have the child not be a mamzer, but that can't always be accomplished. In fact, rare as it is, there are halachic mamzerim in the world, and they're fully Jewish, could have a life of Torah and mitzvot, and they belong in the Jewish community, but they, of course, face terrible circumstances when it comes time for them to marry and have children. Recently in Israel, there was this television show called Otonomiot. I think I saw that it's coming to America on How Do You Get Your Israeli TV on Netflix or something. Like you had Shtisel, right? Do you know about Shtisel? Everybody saw Shtisel. So it's from the same creators as Shtisel. It was less successful than Shtisel. It was less artful. It was less well done. It was a mini series. It's not an ongoing thing. It stars Shuli Rand. If you remember the film Ushpizen, about the Etrog, which was also incidentally based on an Agnon story. Shuli Rand there on the right is the Rebbe. It's a dystopian future in which it's never explained how it happened, but Israel has adopted a two-state solution. Not Jews and Palestinians, but Chilonim and Haredim. The Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, break off and have their own autonomous city-state within larger Israel. And without going into the details, the story, the main character, this fellow in the middle, this Yonah Broidy, is a kind of, he's a very problematic character, and he's involved in trafficking all types of contraband from Israel into the autonomous Haredi country. And he ends up in all types of trouble. In the third episode, we see a woman reading this book. Now, you can't, it happens that the creator of the show, the creator of Shtisel and the creator of this show, a fellow named Ori Alon, who's he's the grandson of Menachem Alon, who was the chief member of the Supreme Court here, he's a great agnonist. In Shtisel, there are a few times where this happens, where there's like little I think they call them Easter eggs, when a filmmaker puts in a little like a scavenger hunt that only few people would notice. So this character is reading a book in bed, but that's all you see in the screen grab, right? Is this book. You would have no way to know what the book is. But in fact, you can see on the right, the cover of the book is the school edition of Vayakov Lemishor. She's reading this book, right? It's kind of planted there. 99.99% of the readers would never have recognized it. But it's an homage to the theme of the book, which is influencing this miniseries. And then later in the final episode of the series, we see Yonah Broid come back from having been away for a very long time, having been presumed dead, and he sees his own Modat Evel, the Pashkevilim, announcing Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, Yonah Broide, that he's dead. He sees pasted on his house his own death notice. He now understands he's been presumed dead. And then he sees his wife coming home with her new husband, and obviously pushing the baby carriage. And like Menashe Chaim, he heads off on his own. Right? Now it's a kind of homage to Vayakov the Mishur. It shows how those themes, which of course are present in world literature in so many different ways, become Judaized, become Agnonized in Vayakov Lemishor, and have ongoing impact in Israeli culture. Do we have time, Yardena? Do we have time for some more? Because I did want to do one more little chunk. Is there like a time limit here?
Yes. Thank you.
Here's chapter 4. The book is divided into 4 chapters, and there's a kind of afterword. The wise can imagine how Menashe Chaim's heart raced as he neared his longed-for haven. He's on his way home. He doesn't yet know what he's going to discover there. When he gazed upon the lofty mountains and the rising hills that surrounded it, saw the Stripa River, the river that runs through town, rolling humbly through the earth at their feet, his spirit grew so agitated he could go no further. He planted his walking stick in the ground, threw down his pack, and lay upon a grassy hillock beneath the shady dome of leafy trees. Let me rest a bit, get my strength back, he said. I can't appear at my house looking half dead. Ha ha ha, what's the joke? He doesn't want to appear half dead, but if he were to show up, he would appear completely dead. He lay for some time, his thoughts drifting. The sun sets in the west, the clouds fly upward, the heavens fall earthward, and the winged breeze flutters over his eyelids. He beholds a small house. His wife waits there by the wayside, her tremulous heart fearful of his fate. This is what he's imagining. The door of her room is open. She rises with a sigh in her hand, a stocking she's mending. She puts it aside as she goes to prepare dinner. Menashe Chaim enters softly. Now this is all in his imagination of what's going to happen as soon as he gets there. Menashe Chaim enters softly. He comes through the open door. No one hears. He walks to the window, bends over and takes the stocking. Who took that stocking? Who took that stocking? His wife asks, puzzled. No one's been here. No one's even passed by. When Menashe Chaim hears his wife's voice, he can no longer contain himself. Oh, Krendel, her name is Krendel Charney. Oh, Krendel, how manifold are thy needles, Menashe Chaim says sweetly. Look, I've pricked my hand. His soul radiates boundless compassion. It was she who labored all her days in the shop, had always borne the yoke, had always supported him without question, without hesitation. And when it came time for him to bring their food from afar, he treated her cruelly like a raven, sending back nothing to sustain her soul, returning empty-handed all he had collected, spent to satisfy his lust for wine. That's he's feeling that he's having like it's a dream, it's a daydream, it's not clear, but he's having this dream of what's going to be when he finally, Od Ma'at, very soon he's on the outskirts of town, he'll be there momentarily. What's that moment of reunion going to be like the soldier coming home from war? But he knows he's guilty. He knows he hasn't treated her properly. He knows he hasn't sustained her the way that a husband should support his wife. Between the first edition of the story in 1912 and the subsequent edition in 1919, and then there were multiple editions. Every time Agnon was an inveterate reviser. Every time the stories would be republished, he would polish them, he would revise them. There were 2 particular significant changes to the story from the first edition to all subsequent editions. In the first edition, when it comes time to being matir the aguna, right? When it comes time for the rabbi to say, yes, we can presume halachically that Menashe Chaim is dead, and therefore Krendel Charney can remarry. In the first edition, it says something like, the learned rabbi examined all of the holy books, and with great difficulty and fear and awe, because after all, this would be the most weighty psak that a rabbi would have to issue is being matir and aguna. He allowed her to, but he doesn't do the homework for us. He doesn't show, like in math, you're supposed to show the work. We, the reader, know that this was a holy rabbi. He was very learned, and he did all the heavy lifting, and he came to the conclusion that she was allowed to remarry. It's like a question in it's a literary question. It's not a halachic question. How do you depict expertise? It's really difficult. There are a lot of movies that show sports, for example. Like think of the Rocky movies, with boxing. So Sylvester Stallone is not actually a professional boxer. None of those actors were. But how do you depict what's meant to look like the world clay, like Ali versus Frazier? So today they can do it all with computer enhancements. But in the 70s, you're making a movie, how do you do it? It doesn't matter. You just have to convince the audience that these are great boxers. So ironically, what do? They show it all in slow motion, right? It's a complete contrivance. And you're sitting there in the movie and you accept the reality. These are the two greatest boxers in the arena. Remember the $6 million man? The Bionic Man, the show from the 70s. We're all people of a certain age. I can take certain things. I teach young students. I can't use any of I had to retire all of my popular references. Remember the $6 million man? They wanted to show him running really fast. So what would they do? They would show him running in slow motion. Da, 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 da. And the audience thinks that means he's running very fast. Or a movie about a musician, like a pianist. So what do? How do you get some actor? He doesn't really know how to play the piano. So they put him in front of the keyboard and he's moving his hands, but you never actually see the hands touch the keys. And when you see just the hands touching the keys, you know that that's a body double who actually does know how to play the piano. And then they dub in an actual recording from, Glenn Gould or Vladimir Horowitz or some actual professional, world-class musician, so that you realize that this person who can't, the actor who can't actually play chopsticks is really. So how do you show that a rabbi, or for example, I saw not long ago a movie about Hemingway, right? Hemingway, what was the process of that writing? It would make the most boring movie in the world. You know what writing looks like? It's hours of staring at the blank page and then ripping up the page after you've typed something on it, right? It would make the worst movie. So how do you depict this is the greatest author of the 20th century at work? So you see him there. There's Hemingway, and he's got a cigar in his mouth, and he's got a glass of scotch, and he's sitting at the typewriter, and he's banging away, just constantly banging away. You hear ding, 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 and he pulls the paper out. You hear those of us of a certain age can still conjure the sound of the paper being pulled out from the roller, and then you see like the pages piling up in a stack next to him, right? And then in a cloud of smoke as the clock is like moving, like you see the clock, like that many hours have passed, and then you see he puts like the title page on top, The Old Man and the Sea, and in 3 minutes on screen, you think you have a sense of what a great work of art is produced, or how a boxing match is boxed. So how do you show the posek at work? It's really hard to do. So Agnon didn't do it. He said the rabbi worked very hard. He looked at all of the holy books. He batted his head against the Sfarim, and he came up with the psak that she's allowed to remarry. There was a critique on the first edition, and Agnon didn't like being critiqued. People said it was inauthentic, that no rabbi worth their salt would have allowed the wife to remarry based upon the fact that the letter was found in the dead man's possession. Right? People said it didn't smack, right? Like this is true. Like whenever you see, like that's what we all loved about Shtisel, because it was so authentic. Even though like all of those actors are are not, none of those actors are religious, but it was so authentic, like every little detail, exactly how you washed Nagelwasser and every little thing, right? It was so authentic. But you know that sometimes you see like frum Jews depicted in movie or TV, and the average, like the housewife in Iowa doesn't know, but we know, no, that's wrong. They didn't get that right. That's not how you say it. That's not how you do it. That's not how you say hamotzi. That's not how you light the candles. That's not right. We know it when we see it. So people said this is not authentic, right? The rabbi would not have made this mistake. So in the second edition, Agnon, even though it comes a bit at the expense of the artistry of the literature, Agnon adds a page and a half. You have it in our edition, where he goes through all of the he gives you all the Mari Makomos for the shir, right? Like it's going to be the shir kloli about Heter Aguna, and he quotes the Gemara, and he quotes the Shulchan Aruch, and he quotes the Rishonim, and he quotes the Achronim, because even though we know that the rabbi made a mistake, the question isn't not whether or not the rabbi made a mistake in allowing her to remarry. We know for a fact that he's alive. It was a mistake to allow her to remarry. But is it a plausible mistake? Might a genuine Talmid Chacham have actually made such a mistake? Or would it have been an act of amharatzus, of ignorance? And this great rabbi, whatever, even though he was mistaken, he wasn't an amhaaretz. So Agnon, in response to these critics, and in response to that Hungarian rabbi who didn't actually know he was reading a work of fiction, and made this critique, Agnon added in all of the halachic material, even though it slows down the story, in order to bolster the idea that it was a mistake, but it was an authentic mistake. There was another major change. At this point in the story, after the section that we just read, when Menashe Chaim is fantasizing about what it will be like when he returns, there was a long paragraph in the original edition. This is the Hebrew text as it appeared in the Poel HaTzair newspaper on May 2nd, 1912. It was removed from later editions. Here's my loose translation of what it says. Not for naught did the uncharitable of Yazlovitz declare. Menashe Chaim came from Yazlovitz. He married Krendel Charny. It's a neighboring town. He married Krendel Charny, who came from Buchach. So when the shidduch was made, when he got married a number of years earlier, the uncharitable of Yazlovitz declared that this match was unnatural. When Krendel Charny came of age, she certainly could have been matched with one fitting to an appropriate man. Only through an act of heaven, through divine providence, did he merit to marry her. In other words, they shouldn't have been married in the first place. And as this marriage came to no good end, unfortunately, it didn't produce children. But worse than that, because of their circumstances, he was forced to leave. He was mistaken for dead. She was allowed to remarry by accident. She gives birth to a mamzer, and he goes off to die in the graveyard. As it happened, her father, blessed memory, had hit hard times and was unable to afford a proper dowry and wedding for his daughter. A very wealthy man of town approached her father and sought her hand in marriage for his son. Oh, it's like perfect. Like what could be better? Doesn't that always happen? If you know rich people, you know who they marry? Other rich people. Why is that? But here, she is a poor girl. She's a family that's fallen on hard times. And a rich guy comes and wants her to marry his son, the perfect escape from her poverty. But her father would not allow her to marry that rich son. The matter was extremely puzzling, causing acrimony in his home. But he would not say a word nor a half word concerning why he rejected the rich man's gracious offer. Some of you know my wife. She's from Riverdale. My grandmother always used to say, you can fall in love with a rich girl just as fast as you can fall in love with a poor girl. But I married for money. No, I married for love, not for money. So here she has a chance to marry for money, and her father won't let it. And people thought this was strange. So that the rich man would cease pursuing the matter, Crandall Charney's father married her off to someone or another, that is, to the aforementioned Menashe Chaim. They were married according to Kedat Moshe Yisrael and Va'ir Yaslovich Navocha. The city was like, why would he marry his daughter off to the poor Menashe Chaim when he could have married her to the daughter of Rockefeller? There must be something going on here, they said. Indeed, as her father lay dying, he cautioned his family in the strictest of secrecy to never enter a marriage, God forbid, with anyone from the family of that rich man, for he is a descendant of the brother and sister. Once a brother and sister were captured away by bandits. Years later, they married each other, unaware of who the other was, and gave birth to sons and daughters. When the matter became known, it was too late to do anything. Some folk kept their distance, calling them mamzerim, but the rabbis placed them under a ban, placed a ban upon anyone who would disparage the family in this way. In time, the matter was forgotten, and they are now known as kosher Jews. Some of their descendants are rabbis and communal leaders. Crandall Charney's father, who was counted among the most punctilious, kept his distance from them. How wondrous are the deeds of the Almighty. Crandall Charney, in the first version, in the excised version, Crandall Charney and Menashe Chaim only marry because she is forbidden to marry someone for whom there is a chashash mamzerut. The Ramah here, we don't have time to go into it, the halacha here discusses a case like this, right? Whether or not it should be publicized that there was mamzerut in a family, and what to do before or after a marriage. But Agnon removes this from later versions of the story. With the first edition of the story, what becomes the cause of the tragedy? What do you think? Does anyone have an idea? Why does our tale take on tragic dimensions? What is the underlying sin for which the wrath of God is brought down and poor Menashe Chaim ends up where he does? Any thoughts?
Well,
Oh, hi, Larry. How are you?
Yeah, okay, fine. This is a terrific session. That he marries her only because of the punctiliousness of her father about the possibility of mamzerus in the family of the rich man. And the result is, because of that violation, that her father shouldn't have, said anything about the rich family. That's exactly what gets then visited upon his daughter,
Right.
through Menashe Chaim.
Right. In other words, the father doesn't want his married daughter. The father doesn't want his daughter to marry a mamzer, so he marries her off to poor Menashe Chaim, and then joke's on him or punishments on him.
She becomes the
In the end,
mamzer.
his grandson is a vaday mamzer, not just a suffix. If that's the case, what kind of tragedy is this?
But why would he take it out of the second edition?
Exactly. In other words, according to the first edition, what kind of tragedy is this?
It's a midah keneged midah. Her father was violated the restriction or the ban against saying anything, so it was revisited on his daughter.
So what does that do to the character of Menashe Chaim in the first edition? How do we evaluate Menashe Chaim in the first edition?
First, he was a simple pawn in all of this retribution.
Right. There's an actual case in the Shut Chesed LaAvraham, which was written by Avram ben Tzvi Hirsch Teumim, who was the Rav in Buchach from 1853 to his death in 1868. Buchach was a small town. When Agnon lived there, in his youth, there were about 10, 12,000 residents, about 60% of whom were Jewish. But for a small little town, it wasn't a shtetl. right? It's not don't think shtetl. It's a town, but it's not a city. It's not Warsaw. It's not Krakow. It's not Berlin. It's not. For a small town, it had a lot of remarkable Talmidei Chachamim. And there are a lot of important Sfarim that were written by people that came from Buchach. And in later years, there were some remarkable Jews that came out of Buchach. Sigmund Freud's grandparents came from Buchach. Simon Wiesenthal was from Buchach. Emanuel Ringelblum of the Warsaw Ghetto Archive of the Onik Shabbos came from Buchach, was a cousin of Agnon. But of course, the most famous Jew to come from Buchach was Agnon himself, the great Nobel laureate. Today, if you visit Buchach, his house is preserved as a kind of center. So in the Shut Chesed Lavram, there is this case of the Ach v'Achot. Agnon was basing, and he did this often, right? He took actual halachic cases from the past and creates fiction based around that premise. This is a tshuva from 1855 about a similar case to that described in the paragraph we just read. I should mention our story. We know from internal evidence in the story, our story takes place begins in 1858. 1858, and it runs for a couple of years. But Nietzsche, you weren't expecting to see Nietzsche after the Chesed Lavram, but who can resist a mustache like that? Nietzsche was reported to have said, it's one of those things, it's not a real quote, but it doesn't matter, it's true. Nietzsche was reported to have said, the Greeks blame the gods, the Jews blame themselves. According to the first version of the story, the whole thing turns it into a very Greek tragedy. There's an act of hubris. The father thinks he knows who a proper person to marry with, and he will not allow his daughter to marry the rich man's son, even though, of course, who doesn't want their daughter to marry the rich man's son? I mean, if the rich man comes to my door asking for one of my daughters, that day we'll marry them off. And instead marries them off to Menashe Chaim. And then the events that occur is divine punishment being visited on the next generation, and that absolves Menashe Chaim of moral responsibility. As Larry said, he's just a pawn. In order to Judaize the tragedy from its kind of Greek tinge, Agnon removes that part of the story in later editions. And by removing it, it puts the whole moral force of the story squarely at Menashe Chaim's feet. Yes, he's faced with terrible tragedy. He's faced with terrible challenges, terrible poverty. Lo aleinu. But that doesn't absolve him of acting morally. There's a midrash here in Shmot Rabbah, in Mishpatim. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, back. Previous. Ashrei Adam Shu made b'nisyono. Fortunate is the man who can withstand trial and tribulation. She'ein birya she'ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu menaseh ota. There is no creature that God does not test. Ha'ashir menasehu im teyado ptucha laniyim. How is a rich person tested? A rich person is tested to see, can he not be a cheapskate? Can he help others? Can he open his wallet to the poor? That's the test for the rich man. Oh God, send me this test. Umenaseh ha'ani im yachol kabel yisurin ve'eno koes. And the poor person is tested in that he has to bear his suffering without anger, without chaos, without chaos. I almost said chaos, but that also. Right? How does the poor person withstand the test? He returned. Menashe Chaim returns, and it's the day they're having the what do they call it? The the night before the bris. It's a word in Yiddish.
Wachnacht.
Wachnacht, right? And all the children are going to say Shema Yisrael with the Rachanimol for the next day's the bris. And what does he do? Well, I mean, his world is turned upside down, but he accepts his suffering, and he goes to the cemetery, and he slowly wastes away. And his only comfort is to know that Krendel Charney had not forgotten him, because the gravedigger, when he discovers Menashe Chaim's story, tells him that a wealthy woman from Buchach had come to set up a grave over her husband. And he knows that it was for him. And when he dies and goes into the grave, this kind gravedigger moves the stone so that he has Shem v'She'erit. There's some legacy. His name will not be forgotten forever. Here's the cemetery in Buchach, not the cemetery in the town where he is buried, but you can imagine, you can see what a Galician Jewish cemetery looks like. Kafka, Agnon often was compared to Kafka for reasons that Agnon greatly disliked. But nevertheless, there is something to be said. Kafka has it's a sketch. It's called a dream. You can find it online. You can Google it, Kafka dream. Everything Kafka's online. Here's Joseph K., the same character we know from the trial. He was dreaming. But here it's surrealistic. In Agnon, it's mere nightmare. Joseph K. was dreaming. It was a beautiful day, and K. wanted to go on a walk. But no sooner had he taken a few steps than he was already at the graveyard. Its paths were highly artificial and practical in their windings, yet he glided along such a path as if hovering unshakably over raging water. From far away, he spotted a freshly dug burial mound at which he waited to halt. This burial mound exerted an almost enticing effect on him, and he felt he could not get there fast enough. Through some extremely skillful manipulation, the stonecutter, succeeded in producing gold letters with an ordinary pencil. I've skipped a bit. In other words, he sees the inscription, which is somehow surrealistically written onto the stone. It was "Here lies." Each letter came out clean and beautiful, deeply incised and in purest gold. After writing those two words, he looked back at K, meaning his own name, who was very, very eager to see what would come next in the inscription, gazed at the stone, paying little heed to the man. And in fact, the man was about to continue writing, but he could not. Something was hindering him. He lowered the pencil and turned to K again. This time, K looked back at the artist, who he noticed was very embarrassed, but unable to indicate the reason for his embarrassment. All his earlier liveliness had vanished. As a result, K likewise felt embarrassed. They exchanged helpless glances. There was some kind of misunderstanding between them, which neither of them could clear up. The artist's first small stroke was a J. It was almost completed, but now the artist furiously stamped one foot into the burial mound, making the dark soil fly up all around. At last, Kay understood him. There was no time left to apologize. In all his fingers, he dug into the earth, which offered scant resistance. Everything seemed prepared. A thin crust of earth had been set up purely for show. Right beneath it, a huge hole with sheer sides gaped open, and Kay, flipped over on his back by a gently current, sank into the hole. But while with his head still erect on his neck, he was welcomed down below by the impenetrable depth. His name, with tremendous embellishments, rushed across the stone on top. Meaning he sees his own tombstone being engraved as he's being lowered into the grave himself. Enraptured by this sight, he woke up. The whole thing was some kind of nightmare. Of course, we're reminded of Dickens, Ebenezer Scrooge, the ghost of Christmas future. When does he turn? When does he break? When he sees his own gravestone. And in Kafka, with relevance for Agnon as well, the critic Adorno said, the crucial moment, however, toward which everything in Kafka is directed, is that in which men become aware that they are not themselves, that they themselves are things. They have become objects. They have become objectified. Menashe Chaim endures what he endures not because of some ancient curse that's placed upon him because of the actions of his father-in-law. That would make it a Greek tragedy. His events take place because he cannot withstand the test that's put forth on him, on the fact that he has been made a thing. He has been turned into an object. And the object that he has been turned into is a poor person. And it doesn't matter, a poor person with a good letter or a poor person with a bad letter. That's the quote that we saw from the second chapter. It's just another frog in Egypt. One more poor person. How can he ameliorate his circumstances? But when he exhibits his own moral flaw by selling the letter, then he's doomed. Not because of an ancient curse, but because the Jews blame themselves. He is morally incompetent, and that's what causes the tragedy. I'll just conclude by telling you, sometimes Agnon, he couldn't leave well enough alone. Didn't these people suffer enough? Long time later, Agnon writes a story called B'na'arenu Uv'zkenenu. It's translated in our series as Young and Old Together. It's actually a political satire. It's set in the beginning of the 20th century in Buchach. It's a satire on the Zionist movement, actually. But it takes place in Buchach, and it takes place in, it's 60 years after the events of Yaakov Lemishor. And there's a minor character, Mr. Hoffman, who in passing, we're told this Hoffman is from an old Buchach family. He's the grandson of the child that was born to Krendel Charney from her second husband after Menashe Chaim disappeared and was declared dead. In other words, he's reminded, the only people that know that there's mamzerim walking around Buchach are the gravedigger who took the secret with him to his own grave long ago, and we, the readers. None of the characters in that later story know anything about this. But we know that the actions of long ago continue to reverberate throughout the town. The section of the story which was put into Geniza, which was taken out because it would have changed the moral force of the story, the tshuva of the Chesed LaAvraham, right, which informed that plot line which was removed, still exists as a vestige, hidden between the lines of the story, that there is such a family of mamzerim in Buchach. No one knows it, but we do. They don't know it, but we do. That the consequences of those moral failings long ago continue for many generations until the end of time, whether or not it's known. This is just a tip of the iceberg of Vayakov Lemishor. There's so much more we could say. If you read it, I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't finished reading it, I encourage you to do so. If you can read it in Hebrew, even better. And I hope we'll have a chance to meet in person and continue to learn together at some point in the future. I'm happy to stay online if there are questions and comments, but everyone else is released. And thanks so much for being with us. And Yardena, are there any other announcements or business from your end?
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.